So, and congratulations. I hear you just got, aren't you the head of the professional journalists? Is that an elected position or?
It is, yeah. I was elected a year ago as president-elect and automatically ascended to presidency. So they had a year to get rid of me and they didn't. So it's me.
Well, congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Senate Pro Tem. We got a lot of issues to talk about, but let me start by asking one that just came up in the last 24 hours with Gavin Newsom's executive order on climate and cars. I think this board is a big proponent that this policy would go a long way, but we're also, we cringe at executive orders at all levels of government. And so I'm just wondering, as head of the Senate, what can and will you do to consider these issues? And do you think that the legislature should have a part to play in this?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there have been attempts at pieces of legislation prior to change these goals and to direct this. That would be pieces of legislation that would go to the governor. So in all honesty, I've got probably a third of my caucus that are very excited. I got a ton of messages saying, this is great, we're ready to go. Of course, I had a few that said, I'm concerned, what does it mean about the implementation? So that's the question. How do we implement it? How do we look at the impacts? And certainly he's put some markers down in terms of what he'd like to see. Obviously, a lot of folks are concerned about the extent of executive orders. This was climate week, when Governor Brown was in office, he ended his tenure doing a major conference in San Francisco. And I think it's raised the bar for all of us. So I guarantee you there will be pieces of legislation to further direct how they think this should look. It'll come up through our budget process as we look at the resources we have through cap and trade and other sources of funding. Clearly, there's a whole arena of this around stopping fracking and what that means and how it gets implemented and the impacts in Central Valley. So there's a lot more to come and a lot more to discuss as we move forward. And the legislature will be engaged in this. There's no way we're going to sit on the sidelines.
I'm curious.
What do you think of his?
Were you given a heads up on this? What kind of timeline did you have before?
I spoke with the governor's office towards the end of last week. We have a number of ongoing kind of working groups that check in with his staff that talk on a regular basis. We sort of established that more as a formal process as we went into March and all came home and recessed due to COVID. We started a number of ongoing conversations with his staff in a more formal fashion. So I did get a heads up, not a lot of the details. So in concept, I think supportive, but it's gonna really turn out to be what are those details and how do we put it through our processes, which is potential legislation and the budget going forward.
What do you think about him starting with, throwing a gauntlet down with an executive order rather than going through the process more formally with the legislature kind of leading the way? Is that appropriate given the scope of what's happening, or is that inappropriate given the fact that there's more legislators here than there are?
Well, I think probably yes and no, and it depends on who you ask. There's a reaction. Legislators want to legislate, and this pandemic has caused a situation where we have seen more executive orders and the governor having to take on the role of the governor during an emergency than any of us probably remember. And a number of you, not all of you, have been around a very long time. Does it concern legislators? Yes, it's why we have a joint budget legislative committee between the Assembly and Senate that has to approve money, money that's not in the course of the budget. You saw a lot of that discussion and a review of budget committees as we were waiting to go back into session when we should have been in session between March and May. So I think we have to continue to have dialogue with the governor and the transparency and hold him accountable and flesh out those details. And you're going to hear a lot of conversation from legislators about how to do that best. I would say, here we are in the end of September. It's almost hard to believe we will be back in session in December, or we'll go back to be sworn in. And I guarantee you a lot of legislators will introduce legislation. I hope we're going to be thoughtful again about that. We don't know what 2021 holds in terms of the ability of a legislative session. We saw ourselves have to stop and interrupt our legislative session this last year with a normal number of bills. So, there's still so many factors that we need to be in communication with the governor, his staff about. Is it unusual that he's doing this? Here's a governor who just got sworn in 2 years ago, and a year into this, a year and a couple of months, is now finding that the way he's having to govern is different than any previous governor in recent memory. So we're all adjusting to this, and we're all making our voices known. I want to be thoughtful about it, but we're gonna do our due diligence and hold him accountable. And there will be pieces of legislation he has to consider. We do get to talk about the budget, and it was, if you will recall, it was the Senate and the Assembly that pushed back on a budget and basically said, we came up with a 2-party agreement and then negotiated with the governor for a 3-party agreement. It doesn't usually happen that way. It usually is the governor. So I think we've managed to work together in very unprecedented times and hold each other accountable as best we can.
Senate Pro Tem President, you and Shirley Weber and Lorena Gonzalez have given San Diego Democrats an amazingly high profile and gotten an insane amount done, way, way more than what I saw when I got here in 2005. But on housing, there's lots of people who are profoundly disappointed about what's been achieved. What's your view of what's been done and what more should be done?
Right. And by the way, I talked to Governor Brown about 7 days ago. I told him I was planning a UT editorial board conversation. He wanted me to specifically say hello to you. Somehow you are uppermost in his mind, even when he's out of office. So good to see you, Chris. I am disappointed that we weren't able to get more done this year. I think, in previous years, I think most of you know, I've pushed for funding for low-income, subsidized, affordable housing. We've had a hard time getting work done as it relates to CEQA, streamlining, those kinds of issues that various stakeholders from the BIA, developers, the realtors, affordable housing folks have been in conversation with about for 20 to 30 years. We finally have made movement on some of the streamlining in CEQA. Clearly, Senator Wiener put out there and threw down a gauntlet of what we needed to do, which in many respects was in line with what Governor Brown had talked about a few years ago in his by right proposals in a budget that he put forward. I think that the difficulty is that you have so many facets and components and complexities with housing and zoning that it's made it hard to get the votes to get things done. This year we were there on a number of bills and the clock ran out on us, and I have no doubt that had SB 1120, which was the follow-up to Scott Wiener's SB 50, that was worked through a lot of stakeholders and clearly more palatable, although not in the minds of some, to getting passage. We got it through the Senate. It passed out of the Senate on the consent calendar. It had the votes in the Assembly, and we didn't get it back in the Senate quick enough. 11:57 p.m. didn't give us enough time to get it into our House and out of our House. Having said that, yes, I'm disappointed. But having said that, I think the foundation that we've set to bring these bills and a couple more back as early as December, I'm going to be optimistic and say we're going to do it. It took me almost 4 years to get SB 2 done, the permanent source of funding for affordable housing. And, I am optimistic that we've set the right foundation because we included everybody in the discussion on these bills. Clearly, we've got to do more housing production. California, we're short 1.8 million units of housing. We should be doing 180,000 in production a year. Last year, 95,000. So we're roughly doing half of that. We have got to deal with this. It is part of the high cost of living in California. It is why we have issues with folks who who are doubling up and tripling up, overcrowding, and in fact, some people leaving the state because of the high cost of housing. So disappointed, but I'm not going to give up.
What bills do you see as priorities on housing? Will the zoning be revisited, or?
I intend fully, my caucus intends fully, 1120 and SB 995, which was the extending the sunset on big projects, but then we included housing in that, that prior piece of legislation, extending the sunset, add smaller housing projects to it so that Central Valley and rural communities could take advantage of that incentive and that tool, the streamlining tool. That was 995. Ana Caballero had a very good bill that looked at vacant retail properties and strip malls, if you will. That didn't come out of a committee in the Assembly. The others made it to the floor in the Assembly. I intend that all of those will be reintroduced, and we'll just keep working. The other two bills had the votes in the Assembly. Now there will be a few new members in the Assembly and the Senate, but we'll work to get them done. I anticipate putting those forward again. Those were Senate caucus products, and two of them may have had my name on it, but they were Senate caucus priorities.
How about that zoning bill? A lot's been written about that and discussed about it, but since we're talking to you for the first time since that, whose failure was that? And is it, if we had a couple more minutes, would it have got done? And why wasn't it kind of back-ended out so that rush at the end didn't affect that bill?
Well, in all honesty, Matt, it was a difficult bill. I mean, a difficult year at best, and a difficult bill because, many that live in single family zones, there was a lot of misunderstanding about what the bill actually does. And, the lot split, duplex, there could be no more than 4 units. I think it got confused with another bill that said 10 units. And of course it had to meet local zoning criteria, the setbacks, the floor area ratios. I think, basically it got down to the end of session difficulty between houses, and, in all honesty, I can't tell you anything other than it should have happened. There was no reason for that bill in particular, or 995, not to be taken up much sooner in the day. The votes were there. We communicated that.
Tell us a little bit about the pandemic, how you think that's going to affect the coming session. I mean, we at the UT aren't planning to go back to our building until January, and who knows if that's going to happen. I imagine you guys are working on a similar uncertainty and timetable. How did it go this year, and what should change in terms of voting remotely and making the job a little easier on people in this time?
Right, Matt. I think, clearly we had to turn on a dime and learn how to address. We focused immediately on the public health, safety, and public health department guidelines in terms of how we operated at the Capitol. And of course, we got 2 distinct houses who sort of had sort of different rules for engagement. But we started with trying to make the Capitol possible to have distancing. I feel like I became a school teacher telling my colleagues and reminding them, wear your mask appropriately. Quit, it's hard to change human behavior. And the Secretary of the Senate, Erica Contreras, immediately started to put in place all kinds of the suggested guidelines from public health. All of my senators got thermometers and masks and everything upon returning to the Capitol. Clearly, we have to do enforcement and pay attention. We changed public's ability to come in. We had to consider, how do we accommodate the media, because your ability to report is important. And before we all got so comfortable with this process of Zoom and how to use it and how to do the remote hearings, we started with remote hearings, and we did a lot of our committees with remote hearing and allowed participation. Chose not to vote, that if you weren't there during the hearing process, the committee hearing process, if you weren't there, you couldn't vote, but you could participate and debate remotely and be heard along with members of the public, media, etc. When we moved to the floor, We then moved more fully into the remote voting and allowing that to be a possibility, particularly for our vulnerable senators who we were doing accommodations for. The Secretary of the Senate, with all staff, by the way, we have 900 people that work in the Senate. Many of them could work remotely. Some of them could not, based on what we had to accomplish legislatively and constitutionally. But we had, HR had in place how to respond to accommodation requests. I think we're going to have to continue to do what we have been doing, which is expecting the guidelines and the public safety or public health department guidelines plus the Senate policies to be adhered to. And, it's just going to have to be a continual reminder. And we will continue to look at the numbers, look at the COVID numbers, the positives, the deaths, the hospitalizations, the ICUs. Clearly and finally, our testing has gotten better. But we still need to monitor this because we are opening up, tier by tier. I'll just stop there. We're going to continue to have to work. And I believe that we need to set the example. We need to be the models of how we need to do this. And I'm going to still have that expectation and work with my caucus to make sure they understand. And I've got members of a caucus and of the Senate who have beliefs from A to Z. We're all different. We all represent different communities. And I've got members who think we shouldn't be in session, period. We should be doing everything remotely, all the way to the Republican caucus, who obviously got quarantined at the end of session.
So it seems like the Senate and the Assembly have different views on it legally on what's allowed remotely. Is that going to get squared away, or will there be agreement before the next session starts, or do you think there will still be differing legal views between the two?
Matt, I hope so. There was communication about intentions going into March, and it was never my intention to just do it without thought and consideration of what was at hand. We didn't do remote voting until the floor session, and I had vulnerable members. And then, of course, it turned out that that was the only way the Republicans were going to have a voice at the end of session in terms of being able to vote and debate. So we got a legal opinion. We communicated with constitutional experts. We got a legal written opinion, but we didn't stop there. Before we engaged in doing a committee hearing and participating remotely, absent even voting, we talked to stakeholders. We talked to the authors of Prop 54. We talked to groups that represent, the public. We talked to members of the media to say, we will only use this if we have to, but we want to be able to do our legislative responsibility and our jobs, but we want to do it in a way that protects public health. And so we sought out all of those stakeholders. We have an opinion. We feel comfortable. We feel justified in what we were doing using remote voting. And again, we only did it at the very end when we needed to accommodate members being able to represent their constituents.
When was the last time you ate at an indoor restaurant?
Indoors? I haven't eaten indoors anywhere since March. I have eaten outdoors at a couple of restaurants, and I have my mask on when the waiters come up and I see what the distancing looks like. I mean, I want to support our restaurants. I've clearly done takeout. I've ordered takeout, and Jennifer is a great cook, by the way.
What is your top priority coming in? I mean, obviously we're in the middle of the pandemic. We just talked about housing and climate change. Is there a single issue that you think the Senate should focus on this year and Sacramento should succeed at passing?
Well, a couple. I always love this question when people say, what's your top priority? I'm like, yeah, but I have,
you only get one, right?
I only get one. Well,
no, you can have a couple.
I do think, well, thank you, Matt. The housing package is going to continue to be a priority. It's always been a personal priority for me. And the fact that we now have the bandwidth to push further, particularly on production, wildfires, wildfire funding, and that's for equipment and support. It's for what we need to do in terms of forest management, all the issues related to wildfires and resources needed for that, along with the climate change issues. I had a sea level rise bill that was that I shelved because of the pandemic. I want to talk about that because that's part of climate change and sea level rise. I represent San Diego County, and sea level rise, while it may not feel like it's immediate right now, it will become. I mean, San Francisco just had to figure out how to raise a 2,200 ton building because of sea level rise. Police reform, which we engaged in this year, and clearly there were a number of bills, and thank you for supporting SB 731. Thank you for the support of Shirley Weber's use of force bill. We've got more work to do. One of the bills Nancy Skinner had was an extension of data information. You know, she was able to get a bill done 1 or 2 years ago that talked about the data that law enforcement had to provide to the public. She had another bill that didn't make it out of the assembly in time. So police reform. Clearly, we've got to focus on our budget. That's separate, but we were able to. We started the year with a $26 billion reserve. Chris, you'll appreciate it. I no longer call it a surplus; it's a reserve. And we ended with a $54 billion deficit that we had to figure out how to manage, and we managed to do that through the course of the budget process. We have an $11.3 billion reserve going into next year, which I think we're going to need unless there's action taken at the federal level, and we get additional stimulus money. We were able to ward off cuts to education, trying to keep some of the critical services money available. And the good news is, which I don't think we should rest on our laurels, our projected revenues have come in at the end of the year 1.1 billion over what we anticipated, and another we're at about 5.4, and in the first part of this fiscal year 2021 we have come in at almost 3.4 billion more, so we're at about 5.4 billion is the real total between over the last fiscal year and this year. And of course, some of that will go to Prop 98 and education off the top, as is the formula. But so things are looking good, but I don't think we should, I think we should be cautious. That's good news for us. And as we start to see the unemployment rates drop a little bit, we still have a long way to go, and we need to focus on the economy. So there's legislation around production of housing, fires, wildfires, police reform, but I think we really have to focus on the economy and anything that's going to help us support small business, create jobs, and focus on the economy.
Let me ask you, so much of the conversation now is about racial inequity and systemic injustice, really disproportionately affecting communities of color. So one of the things on your list, kind of tangentially, you got into it at the end, but education and education reform. I know Shirley Weber has been really advocating for some changes there. Our board has been advocating for greater clarity and transparency on how LCFF money is spent. Is there a chance that we're going to get some changes along those lines? And where do you come down on school reform, particularly as it relates to that pot of money and making sure that people know how it's being spent?
Right. Well, I think transparency is key, and I got to be honest with you, I'm still trying to understand the dashboard as it relates to LCFF. You know, that is, education is not my expertise. I'll be the first to admit it, but it's obviously one of the most important issues in our state. And we've advanced a lot of issues, and certainly it was a lot easier to do it when we had a reserve where we could start to focus. We had started to reinvest in education. Our education budget the last fiscal year was the highest it's been in the state. That doesn't mean it's enough. It means by the revenues, it was the highest. We had finally started to reinvest in higher education, CSU, UC, putting more money into programs that support students' ability to go to school. We were talking about pre-K and child care, early childhood education, those things that help a student be prepared. I clearly supported and made the case before the board via letter and talking to the head of the, oh gosh, it went right out of my head, the State Board of Education, thank you, as it related to support for some of the charter schools and their expansion, one here locally that I had hoped to get a fair shake. But as it comes to the funding, you know, it's clearly one of the reasons I wanted Shirley Weber to run for the assembly. Marty Block was leaving the legislature. He had an education background. I approached Shirley to run for the assembly because I knew we needed her voice. Now she's had a rough row to hoe as it comes to her position on education funding. And I think clearly there's more work that needs to be done, and it's the stakeholders that have to really hash a lot of this out. And that is administrators, it is the teachers, the employee union, parents, and much like housing, it's complex and it gets difficult when all those stakeholders are at the table trying to push forward. I believe Shirley is doing the work that she's doing, and that's the reason she went to Sacramento to work on education and education funding. And then she got the opportunity to work on police reform and racial inequity. And so that was sort of an added benefit. But we have a lot of work to do there. Funding is a big piece of it, I think, and how that funding gets distributed. And you have communities that will say, and I have two different types of districts. I have the basic need districts and the others. So I've got Coronado, Solano Beach, and then I've got San Diego Unified School District, and they disagree on how that formula should be. Mm-hmm. So you can say it's about teachers and unions and parents being in a fight on what's best for kids, but it's also about the type of district and the administration and the leadership there and how the pie gets split up and whether they're going to agree, disagree, and try to use their influence to get you to change the formula or keep the formula. And that's why I think you saw Governor Brown, try to carve out some categories of funding to fix what seemed to be a problem over here and a problem over there. Now, Dr. Weber is trying to go straight at the heart of it. And I don't know if any of that kind of makes sense. That's my layperson's understanding of the big picture and what we need to do. And
is this the year for it or no, because of the pandemic?
Well, I think the pandemic, I think it makes it more difficult because now what we're trying to do is figure out how to provide broadband, which the state is behind on. You know, we talk about infrastructure, all kinds of infrastructure. You know, the picture of two kids getting their internet in the parking lot of a Taco Bell, how do you get that out of your head? How do you get that out of your head? We've got to work on broadband, expanding it. We had a bill for that. We had two actually that didn't proceed forward, a Senate and an Assembly bill. We have, you know, we're having to expend a lot of money to clean the schools and make sure there's PPE for the schools. We're having to provide more technology to kids. So I don't know but it will be part of the discussion. There's no way that the members who are engaged in the funding or the curriculum or the policy stuff around education are going to back off of that just because we're in a pandemic. It may slow us down, it may alter and cause us to pivot left or right, but I don't think you're going to lose the desire. People get elected to go work on these issues. And I don't think you're going to see Dr. Weber back off. I think you're going to see her increase her efforts.
In the summer of 2019, we had an interview with Dr. Weber, and she expressed frustrations that more people didn't see public education as a civil rights issue, specifically with regard to laws that allows teachers to decide where they teach and give, normally funnel teachers who are less effective to poorer neighborhoods. And that has always resonated with me. If it's a civil rights issue, it should be foundational for Democrats, but it doesn't seem to be.
Well, I think a lot of things might need to be foundational. Look how the difference I would say is look at Dr. Weber working on AB 392 and how difficult that was several years ago. And now all of a sudden, culture changes, sentiment changes, things happen that cause us to reevaluate and rethink. Maybe we think racism dependent on where you come from and your life and whether you have privilege or not that you recognize or don't recognize. All of a sudden something happens that makes you become more aware of the realities, and we're shocked. And then we say things need to happen. Well, Dr. Weber said 392 needed to happen 2 years ago. And all of a sudden 392, people this past year seemed to present 392 as if it were nothing. Well, it wasn't nothing. It was significant 2 years ago. We've moved. The Me Too movement. We've moved. But the focus has got to continue to be on these issues. And I think that's what people are afraid of. That's what women are and have been afraid of, that Me Too moment was just one moment. And then we'll forget. Or the search for racial equity and the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. The Black Caucus is afraid that momentum will go, which is why they were so hard in trying to push some legislation, even during a truncated legislative session where we probably didn't get to discuss these things as much as we typically would. They're afraid we're going to lose the momentum. And I hope not. I think we have an opportunity here on both of those issues I just mentioned. We have an opportunity here, and we're the ones that can't let it lapse. But I understand the fear.
When do you think schools should reopen? How should that decision be based? And how do you factor that into your budget, obviously, which involves state schools that are not open, yet students are paying what they were a year ago?
Yeah. I can't remember what conversation it was, but it was a recent article media thing where a public health official was commenting and there were questions about students. Have we focused enough on kids and students and young people and the issue of them going back to school and the interaction they have with their teachers, administrators, then they go home to their parents. Do they get to see their grandparents? I've heard all the stories of how people are trying to manage all of that. I don't have kids right now, nor grandparents still alive. But I think we have to look at these things as communities. And I think, I think this is the difficulty of what the governor is dealing with when he looks at counties and tiers and what's happening in this community versus that. Schools are communities and they're within our communities. And I think that some of that does have to be on a community by community basis. It'd be nice if we could do a one size fits all, but what's happening in each community that makes the numbers higher in one community versus a number, and that impacts our kids, and it impacts the families of the kids, it impacts the teachers who are families. So, I don't think it's a simple answer. I do think the local component is really important in that conversation. And I think the state has got to be focused on resources and trying to make sure there are additional resources over and above what is needed for the academics and the support of the schools, what they get right now. And by the way, we did make sure schools didn't lose money because they weren't in school. That tax-based issue of how schools are funded, school districts are funded. That was one of the actions we took in March to make sure that school districts and schools were not losing revenue because they weren't in school. Our goal has got to be to make sure that the protective gear is there, and that's a lot of money cumulatively over time. And I think we have to continue talking to the public health experts about how best to do that. And, as testing is available and when a vaccine becomes available, how that gets rolled out to the most vulnerable, the ones with the highest risk, and that we follow those kinds of guidelines.
When would you take a vaccine? Would you like to be at the very outset when it's available, or would you wait?
I shouldn't be. I'm not a high risk person. I think there are essential workers. There are older, more with, comorbidities and underlying conditions, there's plenty of people ahead of me that need to get that vaccine. Having said that, as they become available, because people, I want to make sure I tell you, I think vaccines are important, and the herd immunity issue at some point comes into play. I hope we get to the point where we're debating whether we should get a vaccine or not because we support or don't support vaccinations, as opposed to the fact that we only have 10 million to give out. And, so I'm not first in line, no.
But you trust the science and vaccinations, is what you just said too.
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
You
Talk
touched
to
on
Shirley Weber about vaccines. She'll give you, as only Shirley Weber can do, she will give you her perspective on why that's important from a racial perspective, from a blue collar working poor. Anyway, I digress.
You mentioned wildfires. Our president took a lot of grief for his comments about the way our forests are managed in California, the jokes about raking and those sort of things. But are there some real points to be made there about how forest management should be updated, both on federal land and state land?
Well, I would tell you there's been a huge effort underway in California and forestry management. If you talk to people in the industry, and I actually have a conversation with members of the Forestry Association later tonight, the state has been engaged and doing that, because we already, several years ago, we've been, as you know, of course, San Diego was on the cutting edge of all of these wildfires in 2003, 2007. Then we had the bug, whose name I never can pronounce, started killing all of the trees in California. We've been engaged in our forestry management overview for a number of years now in California. And those arguments between how people think it should be done, from the environmental community to those engaged in the industry, those dialogues and conversations have been happening. The state has actually been forward-looking in terms of what we now need to do around forestry management. The federal government, not so much. Now, departments, our state departments that deal with these issues are engaged with our federal counterparts, but they're behind. And of course, you know how much land in California is actually federal land versus state. So I'd say are we perfect? Are we where we need to be as a state on our responsibility? No, but we've come a long way just in the time I've been in the legislature, and the 10 years I've been there. I've paid attention to the conversations, and we are in a pretty good position. Having said that, we still need to put more resources towards management.
Anyone on the board want to jump in with a question?
I have one. Hi, I'm Christy Totten. I don't think we've met before, but it's nice to meet you. You know, a lot has been written about how the state was once prepared to deal with a pandemic, became unprepared for budgetary reasons. I'm just wondering, what is the lesson there? And, what is the state doing to prepare for future disasters that are a little less common than, say, wildfires?
Right, that's a great question, and it's one of the first questions when we realized what our stockpile looked like. We started to talk about things like, what is our stockpile at the federal and the state level? And we realized, I talked to Carmela Coyle, who is the head of the Hospital Association in California, and they started evaluating a lot of those things, and the special committee that I appointed, the Emergency Pandemic Response Committee, which is not a committee we had in the Senate, started to look at those issues, particularly around the stockpile. And what we realized, this is so common sense, it's almost embarrassing, that whatever you have in the stockpile, you need to be changing out. I think you heard Gavin talk, or the governor talk about that in his early press conferences. You can't put on a mask and have it break because it's been in storage so long that that it's degraded or whatever, disintegrated. So we started talking about a process and a plan going forward to make sure that you are changing those supplies out, and a system with hospitals where you do it that way so the product gets used, you don't waste it. you know, you use it and you're continually replenishing what's in the stockpile. Now, having said that, how often do you really need ventilators? You know, I mean, we need a better plan. And what we did have available, the mobile hospitals, we used to have more mobile hospitals available. We clearly let that go by the wayside in the decade of following a recession in 2009. And so, you know, the reminder is you need to always be somewhat prepared for things that you don't anticipate, right? A pandemic. So I think that, and I think we've learned that there are populations of people that we need to be better prepared to serve. Residential care facilities, the assisted living facilities, and clearly our prisons and jails. So I intend to continue with an emergency pandemic special committee. Of course, we did this after the major wildfires in San Diego in 2003 and 2007. There was a special joint committee of the Assembly and the Senate that was put together. Chris Kehoe was one of the chairs of it when she was in, can't remember if it was Assembly or Senate when she became a part of that, but clearly that was helpful to us as we started to see the wildfires pick up. We need to do the same thing as it relates to this situation with the pandemic and you know, the mobile hospitals. The federal government came in and provided us a number of mobile facilities that we could move throughout the state. One was in San Diego. So we've got to make sure that we don't forget this too soon, and we stay focused on how we keep that stock in place.
Along those lines, how do you expect to work with President Trump if he's reelected? I mean, so much was made about the friction between California and the president. Should that be a concern for Californians, or do you think that people will move past kind of that prickly, you know, relationship and things will be okay in terms of people being protected from wildfires and pandemic and, you know, money flowing between the two?
Well, you know, Matt, I'm sitting in my office here, downtown San Diego, but I will say I would do everything in my power in the next 43 days to make sure that doesn't happen. I think, I'm sorry, you know, I know I'm the head of the Senate, the Democratic caucus, and I've been the speaker, but I'm also from San Diego, so I don't think I've ever been a self-righteous Democrat. You know, I had the opportunity to meet John McCain, and I had a great deal of respect for him. I want someone that's going to follow the science and the economics, and, you know, to Chris's point, we should, you know, on this pandemic, when you have the head of the Federal Reserve Board, current and past, and you have the head science and medical people all saying the same thing, how you open up, stay closed until you're sure you have a handle on the testing and the tracing. When you have all those people in sync, we should be listening to them. You know, I think whether it's pandemic or fires, you know, we will have to find a way to work with whoever is in the White House in January. And I got to commend Governor Newsom. He has done his best to balance that, you know, when he can. But I hope we don't have to face that situation, frankly.
We hear a lot of concern, obviously, about Proposition 13. Nobody down here wants
the split roll.
Wants to be the original Prop 13.
Oh.
Nobody wants it to be touched at all, and we see a lot of efforts to pick at it from various angles. And now we've got Props 15 and Props 19, which have those sort of impacts. So right. I'm wondering, given that future budgets may not be as well funded as current budget, what can we do to make sure that California's housing remains protected from increasing taxes?
Well, I think number one, I think Proposition 19 was really an interesting combination of stakeholders, from police and fire to the realtors, trying to address some issues that they thought important and less about undoing Prop 13 than giving flexibility in terms of homeowners and property owners. Now, Prop 15, I have such a hard time remembering all these propositions, their numbers. Prop 15 are the split roll. To your point, that does tinker around the edges of Prop 13 in a way to provide more money to education and even fire districts. So I think that is, I don't anticipate seeing anything other than attempts to do that. I know there are people that would like to change drastically Prop 13, but I just don't see that as the reality, because the voters are pretty clear on how they feel about Prop 13 overall. It's why you haven't seen movement there other than around the edges, as you say, to address certain issues and try to rectify and make equal some issues in terms of revenue and funding. But I don't see, unless the people want to change this, I don't see that it's going to change drastically other than what we've talked about in these propositions.
Where do you support Prop 15?
I do support Prop 15.
Why don't you see that as a risk to small businesses particularly? I mean, it seems like a big increase to them at the absolute wrong time.
Well, actually, Prop 15 there is a whole coalition of small businesses that actually support it. They work together to gain support for the split roll conversation, and it's about part of that negotiation. And I don't know all the fine points of that, how it moved forward. I wasn't part of the stakeholder groups that worked to put that together and frame the language. But it had a coalition of businesses, money for local government as well. I mean, local governments lost out significantly when Prop 13 was passed. That's why we have issues of revenue and local government money funding, whether it's county or cities. So they worked with a coalition of folks to try to put something forward that they thought would be palatable that included small businesses. Probably not every business agrees. It depends obviously on size or your philosophy generally. But I think it was framed to also help small business recoup some resources.
How about another ballot measure out there is Prop 16 on affirmative action? Where do
I
you
support. I've already contributed significantly to that. Does the UT support? I think you support Prop 16.
We haven't weighed in yet. We're meeting with
Oh,
this
you
in
haven't.
a week or two. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Madam
questions?
President, I wanted to ask you, we have crossed paths a long, long time ago, and you probably don't remember Laura Castañeda. I wasn't here. I'm new with the UT, but I wanted to ask you, with such a large Latino population in California, and obviously many, including undocumented people that are not as involved in the political process, you mentioned earlier you had two very different entities that you serve. How can Latinos in this state feel like their voice is being brought to the table?
Remind me what I said about two entities served. I'm not remembering what I said.
You were just mentioned about the difference between San Diego and Coronado and so on.
The school on the education funding, right? The two different types of districts and how they get funded.
And I'm not just talking about education, but I'm sure that is.
Yeah. Thank you. I was just trying to remember what that reference was. Well, I think the voices of Latino are absolutely heard, and I mean the community is roughly half of the population in California now. Significant strides, I think, in terms of representation, in terms of organizations that basically reach out, whether it's to local government, county government, state. Clearly, I think there needs to be more voices heard at the federal level. I mean, I think the voices in California reflect the constituency of California So much so at the state level that, you know, one of the things that we recently did, and that is the influence of the people of California, the residents of California, whether undocumented or, U.S. citizens, they're residents. I like to talk about residents of California because we have a lot of the revenue and resources is due to the work of folks who are undocumented. So one of the biggest things I was excited about was the earned income tax credit that I helped champion when I was speaker. It finally got extended to I-10 filers, people who work and contribute to our economy but aren't able to be recognized. Healthcare. I think there's been a lot of influence, whether we're talking healthcare, unemployment insurance extended to those who are undocumented because of the revenue and the contributions that they make in our state. These are our residents. And so I think the influence is heard. I think you've got powerful voices at the local level and at the state level in terms of representation. And I think finally in elected representation, you're beginning to see that representation reflect the true diversity of the state of California. And whether it is members of, whether it is gender-based, women versus men, women being elected and appointed and represented and using their voices to represent communities, whether it is African-American, Latina. If anything in the legislature, we lack API representation in the Senate, I would say. And we lack representation in the Senate. There's 40 of us from the African-American community. We finally, historically, the Senate has now elected 5 Latino women to the legislature in the Senate. That is the highest number we've ever had. And so I think the important thing is that voices of community are being heard and people are being appointed and elected that represent more voices. Now, clearly we don't represent, the representation elected doesn't represent every community. And so there's a ways to go, but I feel very proud that California, when you look at the diversity of our state, is becoming more representative. It doesn't mean we're where we need to be, but I think the voices are heard when you look at powerful positions like Alex Padilla as Secretary of State or Javier Becerra as the Attorney General. There have been strides. Lorena Gonzalez, Appropriations Chair, one of the most powerful people in the State Assembly. But, it's important that we continue to listen. And I'm really proud of the San Diego delegation. I mean, if you look at our delegation, we are, for a region, the most diverse group in the state, I really believe, when you look at us. And of course, we're a border community. We represent the border of Mexico and California. And we see ourselves as an economic region. San Diego is finally, I think, given real recognition of that as opposed to just talk. We saw the governor respond when he first got elected. The combination of a number of us went to the governor and said, you need to help us at the border as it relates to what was going on there with people coming across, and how do we house and help people feel safe from other parts of Central America. And I really applaud Gavin Newsom for stepping forward and then also putting money into being able to provide legal representation so that the individuals who needed to find a home would have that legal representation and a voice to support them. So we have a ways to go, but I'm proud of the things that we have done and what we've started to do in so many areas, whether it's education, healthcare, criminal justice reform, resources, and a recognition that those in our state that are undocumented are contributing to the economy of our state. And therefore, when there is a pandemic, they need access to resources, unemployment insurance. They need access to health care. They need access to protective gear. And so we're not perfect, but I think that is the voices of the people who said what they expect and what they want, and that Californians actually support the diversity.
Thank you.
I've heard
Sorry.
your name put forward as a replacement, a potential replacement for Senator Kamala Harris, should she become our vice president. Is that a job you would want?
Well, that's flattering. But, you know, I'm running for re-election. I am the president pro tem of the Senate. It's a job I really enjoy. So I think I need to focus on the here and now. And let me be clear, though, I clearly want Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to win. And then we'll deal with that. You know, I might give up this gig to go be a backup singer to Dolly Parton. I keep offering, but she hasn't taken me up on that offer. So if any of you have any ability to help that, I would clearly love that.
We believe in you.
Thank you.
Senator, I don't think I've ever mentioned this before, but I was also born in Virginia in the 1960s, and I also studied political science at a Virginia college. I went to William and Mary, and you went to Emory and Henry. So,
oh my gosh!
Thank God I'm in San Diego is all I can say.
Well, where were you raised, Chris?
My father worked for the Pentagon. I was born in Alexandria, so I lived 11 years.
Virginia. That's not Virginia. Sorry.
Well, William and Mary's Virginia.
Yes, it is. It's a wonderful institution. I couldn't get in there. I had to go elsewhere, but thank you. I didn't know that, Chris.
I hide it.
Well, you don't have the accent. That's because you're from Northern Virginia.
That's true.
I do have one follow-up on climate change, but I want to make sure, Matt, we only have a few minutes. Do we have anything left on our policy list?
Go for it. Yeah.
I just wondered, so if we do see the governor, using executive order, and, as you said, it took you 2 years to get your very important housing bill through. Just this month, the Chronicle was describing the challenges that the Senate and the Assembly have in working together. What can we actually expect as far as climate change from the legislature, whether it's specifically from the Senate or otherwise? Because I think that's really helpful to understand.
Well, I would say that there is quite a number of Assembly members and senators who are engaged in all aspects of climate change. I mean, it's an issue that I think there is broad consensus on. Now, how you do some of these things.
What's realistic?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, former pro tem Senator De Leon's SB 350, sorry. SB 350, which set very aggressive goals on renewables, was something that, had some concerns, but we worked through it in the Assembly. I mean, I think if you look at the Assembly and the Senate, that is an issue that many of us seem to be unified on: climate change, more aggressive goals. I think if anything, we need to kind of pull ourselves back a little bit to see, okay, how will we implement it, and how we make sure that we don't leave anybody behind as we're implementing such aspirational goals. And that's what you've seen a lot of the discussions about come out of various parts of the state: Central Valley, Bakersfield, Kern County, some of the ag areas, and how do we, and not even just that, some urban areas where those goals and those mandates might impact people who can't afford an electric vehicle. We've had those discussions. So I think our conversation is going to be, how do we implement these things and make sure that we are not leaving communities behind, and they're able to have the same access and the same ability to, if we're talking vehicles per se. I mean, there's lots of other issues, but that is an example. How do we not leave anybody behind? And those are going to be the tougher discussions. How do we pay for some of these things? How do we incentivize some of these things in a reasonable timeline and fashion? we clearly all would like to do better on any of these goals. It's a matter of how we get there. So I do think the Assembly and the Senate will be unified on some of on the goals. And then we'll work through, we got a lot done together this year, despite, kind of the murkiness of the end of session. At the end of session, there's always issues between the Republicans and the Democrats. There's always issues between the houses. That is historically true. Those are the stories people love to hear about. But most of the time, we managed to get a lot of things done, and we did this session. I have no doubt that the Speaker and I will work to figure out how we feel like we are getting the accountability with the administration and how we rectify some of the things that we didn't get done this year. Because people push back on us, rightly so, rightly so. And so I know that we'll figure out a way to do the work that needs to be done.
I think in the interest of time, we'll let you go and hope that we can do this again. This is a good conversation, and I think helpful as you end one session and look towards another. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you all. Good to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, Tony. Bye.
Be safe, be well.